Social studies is a living, breathing thing, that's for sure. We look to Europe in time period 1. Now, some of you on your last reading quiz wrote about things that were in your textbook, but your textbook gave you a little bit of background pre-time period 1. You want to make sure that when answering a question that says a time period, your evidence comes from within that time period. So even though it might have been in the book in those pages, it doesn't answer the question because the question is about the time period we're studying. So we're looking at time period 1 in Europe. And so Europe is normally divided in half. We look at Europe in 2 halves. How is Europe normally divided when we study it? What direction or structure?
Western.
Eastern and West, yes. Why not North and South? Why not Northwest and Southeast? It's East and West for one reason. Anybody know what that one reason is why we look at Europe East and West and not other ways?
The Berlin Wall.
Nope. That's good. That's not, I guess, that happened. I was alive when that happened. Whew. Now, granted, I'm getting old, but this has been the way we've looked at Europe for 1,000 years.
The main powers are on each
warmer.
side.
You're getting warmer. What power specifically is divided that divides Europe culturally, especially?
Oh, religion.
They have a different religion.
Religion. There we go. So this is an East-West religious divide. Okay. In the West, our primary religion is going to be the Catholic faith of Christianity. And in the East, it's going to be the Orthodox faith. We mentioned this very briefly when we discussed Christianity a few weeks ago. They're both Christians. But before our class starts in the year, you don't have to know the year, but not too far ahead of this, in the year 1054, we have what's called the Great Schism. Schism is a fancy word meaning to break apart. So if you ever need to break up with a significant other and you don't want to draw it out, you don't want to have an awkward, lengthy discussion probably, just tell them it's time for you to schism. And they'll probably be confused, and then you can kind of slip away, and by the time they figure out what the word means, you've told them, but you didn't stand there and have a long conversation about it. So I would encourage you to use vocabulary in many instances in your life, including if you must end a romantic relationship someday. So a schism is to break apart. The main issue is about who's in charge. We discussed this earlier. In the West, we have the Pope, who is the head of the Catholic Church. There is one of him, at least for most of our history. He has the authority over all political rulers. He can tell kings what to do, theoretically. And in time period 1, for the most part, that's how that works. Eastern Europe feels like we should have more local control. We should have local languages as the languages of the Bible in our countries and our regions. We should have sermons delivered in local languages. In the Catholic faith, all sermons were delivered in Latin, which most people did not understand or speak. Versus if you went to Serbia, your Orthodox church service would be in Serbian. So average people couldn't read the Bible, but they could certainly understand their priest preaching about it in church on Sunday. So it's a division culturally, and we will see a lot of different beliefs that come out of that, and why to this day we still tend to look at Europe as a Western and Eastern society, divided historically by religion. Not so much today, but those historic roots take shape and further kind of divide us to this day. So let's talk about the Eastern part briefly, because frankly, in time period 1, the East is on the decline while the West is starting to rise up. So the East is going to be more of a struggle. The major empire in Eastern Europe are people called the Byzantines. This was in your reading. Several of you mentioned them in your reading quizzes for number 3. The Byzantines are an interesting group of people. This would make more sense if we had studied ancient Rome, but this year we just don't have the time to do that. The Roman Empire, like many empires will struggle with, got too big towards the end of its life. It was so large, it was hard to control that many people. Okay? So, one of the things the Romans did to try to preserve their empire was to divide it into smaller parts. And so it is the Western Roman Empire that will be defeated by the Huns and the Goths and those people and is destroyed. The Eastern Roman Empire, I've got a senior here. It was a senior trying to enter my room, so I'm going to have to tell him he doesn't belong because he didn't read the schedule. Just a second, please, kids. Sorry. Because he's going to keep doing this unless I tell him to stop. Just a second. Hey, Jude. Jude Bretz. This is for sophomores. You don't need to be here. Got it?
Huh?
Jude? This is for sophomores, Jude. You don't need to be here. Read your schedule. Thank you. All right. At least you got the message quickly. I have many faults, and I'm sure already you all could list some of the things Mr. Rich does wrong. But if you say, I didn't know, I have many faults. You will always have a schedule. It will always tell you what to do. You may not look at that schedule, but you will always have one. And some of us don't look very thoroughly. Now, anyway, the Byzantines are going to be the eastern part of the Roman Empire that survives after the fall of the western part, and eventually they evolve into the Byzantines. So by the time we get to time period 1, these people have been part of a major civilization for almost 2,000 years. And so they will have a lot of the characteristics of the Roman Empire. The Romans were the ancient world's greatest builders, engineers, architects, whatever you want to call it. They created concrete. They invented the dome, the arch. They had aqueducts that carried fresh water from hundreds of miles away, in some cases from mountain ranges into cities. They were excellent, excellent, excellent builders. And so the Byzantines are also excellent, excellent builders. But by the time we get to time period 1, the Byzantines have been around for over 700 years, and they're starting to decline. Their empire is based in today what we call Turkey, the city of Constantinople, which is named after Constantine, the Roman emperor who legalizes Christianity. Today it's called Istanbul, one of the major cities in Turkey. Turkey, as you may know, is part European, part Asian. And the Byzantines also controlled a lot of the Middle East, Southeast Europe, etc. By the time we get to 1200 CE, which culture do you think is starting to challenge the Byzantines for authority in the Middle East and Eastern Europe? Which kind of people are threatening their power?
The
Ottoman Empire.
Yes, so Turkish Muslims, yes. We will talk more about the Ottoman Empire later, but for now, various Islamic empires, most specifically the Ottomans, are slowly going to start to defeat the Byzantines. So by the time we get to 1450, the end of time period 1, the Byzantines still exist, but just barely. They only control their capital city and a little bit of the territory around it. They've lost pretty much all of it. So the Byzantines are a glorious and powerful situation, but at some point, they are going to lose that ability, okay? So understand that is going to happen because of Islamic empires increasingly impacting these people, all right? Yeah?
I'm sorry, I've had a question for a bit.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is this before Protestant was a thing?
Correct. Protestantism is going to be in our second time period. Martin Luther, who writes a list of complaints against the Catholic Church and starts what is called the Protestant Reformation, that occurs in the year 1517. So that is time period 2, because time period 1, where we are now, ends in 1450.
Okay.
Okay, good question. And never apologize for asking a question. That's why we're here. I want you to ask questions if you'd like. Okay, so you're good. So as I was saying, the Byzantines are in charge of much of Eastern Europe, but they are declining in power due to the increasing threat of Islamic empires such as the Ottomans advancing to their territory. Now, the Byzantines, the only other thing we will mention, did Ben Schuller get kicked out? I'm going to assume he is. Ben Schuller, are you on here currently? Nope. Okay, so he got kicked out. Here he comes back. The Byzantines are Orthodox Christian. They're in Eastern Europe, so they have different cultural beliefs than people in Western Europe. As your textbook told you, the emperor of the Byzantines is also the head of their church. So he is a political and a religious leader. Versus the Pope and the Catholic Church in the West are more independent of individual kingdoms, like France or England or the Italians or whomever that may be. All right?
Mr. Rich,
Yes,
do the Mongols come into the picture right about now, or?
they do, but they don't actually do a lot of damage to the Byzantines. By the time the Mongols get to Europe, the Byzantines are really The Byzantines are in the southern part of Eastern Europe. The Mongols come through Russia towards like the central and northern parts.
Okay.
But yes, we will absolutely talk about the Mongols later. And again, I have a Brady I. I do not have a Brady I on my roster. So again, I'm going to tell this person not to. So if you have a friend that or it says Brady iPhone, let me see. Do I have a Brady? I don't remember Brady.
Brady Reisinger.
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, that's probably true. You're right. I'm going to let him in. If he starts playing music, he's going out. And he wasn't here earlier, so that could be him. So anyway, that's really all you need to know about the Byzantines at this point. I will show you one thing just because I think it's really beautiful. Probably one of the most famous Byzantine accomplishments. Again, they're great builders, they're architects. It is a building that is started as a church. When the Ottomans will eventually conquer it, it becomes a mosque, as you will tell by the modifications to the building. In the 20th century, it becomes a museum. And just for about maybe a month ago, the state of Turkey made it a mosque again for the first time in over 100 years, which is kind of an interesting decision that gets into a lot of details I'm not going to discuss with you, but it is kind of interesting. And this is called the Hagia Sophia. Let me pull that up, show you that picture. Hagia Sophia in Greek, which was the language of the Byzantines, means holy wisdom. So it's enormous. It opened in the year 537. So this is a building almost 1,500 years old. In the center, you see the main structure of the building. Then you see those minarets, those tall towers around the outside that were used by Muslims to call people to prayer. Those were obviously added after the Ottoman Turks conquer the Byzantines and turn it into a mosque. So that's an example of, and if you want to see how big it is, if you look at the bottom of the picture, you'll see people standing in line outside. And there's a couple of vehicles. You can see the relative size of the vehicles and the people to the overall building. It is a massive, massive structure, and it is over 1,500 years old, which is pretty remarkable. So anyway, just wanted to show you that just for a second. All right, now I'm going to go back to the whiteboard after I stop sharing. And so that's really all we need to know about the Byzantines. The other Eastern European society that I will mention very, very briefly are the Russians. Russia will be much more important for us later. As you may know, Russia is a massive country, the biggest in the world today. They are one of the richest countries in the world, and their leader, Vladimir Putin, exerts quite a bit of influence around the world. But Russia has to start somewhere, and right before our class starts in 1200, your textbook calls it they're just the Rus. It's one city. It's literally one city. And then over the next couple hundred years, they grow, they conquer, they farm, they trade, and they become larger and larger and larger. The Russians will decide, at least one of their rulers will, to become Orthodox Christian. So they will follow the example of the Byzantines. So they will also be Orthodox Christian. And they will have a good trade relationship with a strong, powerful empire, at least until the Byzantines start to struggle towards the end of time period 1. Now, the most important thing probably that we need to talk about the Russians, which is the only thing in period 1, they will, as one of you mentioned, get conquered by the Mongols. So the Mongols are going to conquer much of Russia in the 1200s. So in the beginning of time period 1. Without giving away too much about the Mongols, the most famous ruler of the Mongols is a guy named Chinggis Khan. Not Genghis. It's actually Chinggis with a C. Then why do people say it's with a G? Well, because supposedly about 500 years ago, one scholar wrote down the wrong letter for his name and everybody else just copied it. It's actually Chinggis, not Genghis. But in the long run, it doesn't really matter. When Chinggis Khan dies, he divides his massive empire into 4 parts. 3 of his sons and 1 of his grandsons. And each one of those empires will be run by a different person, and they will start to have slightly different beliefs, attitudes, policies, etc. The Mongols that conquer Russia are really your most stereotypical Mongols. I don't know if you have any idea about the Mongols, since we haven't read about it yet, but when I say the word Mongol, does anything come to mind outside of the name Genghis Khan? Do you have any perceptions about them?
I know that.
Oh, you go.
No, you're fine.
Horses.
Okay, they rode horses. Yes, good. Stellan?
I know that they were really advanced in war tactics. I think they're one of the first people to shoot bow and arrow from horseback, if I remember correctly. They had a lot of.
Yeah, both of those things are true. So they're advanced warriors. Oftentimes they're depicted as being brutal, violent, pretty awful, even for war, really bad. Well, that stereotype comes from the Mongols that conquer the Russians. These people are known in Russia as the Tatars. And if you don't remember this, that's fine. But the translation of the word Tatar, Tatar, is the people from hell. The Mongols that conquer Russia are known as the people from hell. What do you think that implies about their treatment of Russian people? Bad. Obviously, very, very, very bad. Destruction, mass killing, rape, all sorts of horrible behaviors that we would not support or condone in the modern world. Now, they're excellent conquerors, but they weren't as much interested in many cases of ruling. They were more interested in conquering. And so the Russian state in its early days will be pretty severely handicapped by its treatment by the Mongol invaders. They're going to become basically a servant state to the Mongols. All right? So really, that's all we need to know about Eastern Europe is we had the Byzantines on the way down. If our class started earlier, we'd talk more about how awesome they were, but they're not really that awesome in period one. And the Russians who are just starting, and then think of it like someone who lived a 70-year-long life. This is like the Russians at age 10 got conquered by the Mongols, and it severely hurt their growth, severely hurt their growth. And so Eastern Europe, we're going to see a pattern for this entire class that for the most part, Eastern Europe is generally weaker than Western Europe. And that's pretty much consistently true for most of our class. Okay? Now, the Western part of Europe. Let's translate over there. Western Europe was the home of the Roman Empire, which dies out in the 400s. So it's already been gone by over 700 years when our class starts. When the Roman Empire is destroyed, nothing really like it takes its place. It's not like another empire comes in and sets up shop. So when the Roman Empire collapses, there is no strong empire to take over. So there is a time of less trade, less cultural achievements. Some people in Europe call this the Dark Ages. As we have learned more and more about this time, it actually wasn't that bad, but there is not a whole lot of culture. The economies are limited. There are no really major large states that last very long. And so it's not the best time for European culture, especially with what's coming for them in the future when they will become a major force in the world. In period one, let me be very clear, Western Europe is not a powerful place either. Neither side of Europe is that important on a global scale in period one. We'll say that one more time. Neither side, West or East, is that powerful, significant in trade in period one. Later periods, yes. Period one, nope, not so much. Okay? And of course, there are little things here and there that would challenge that. But remember, our class is big picture. We're looking at big picture trends, not little tiny things or exceptions. There'll always be exceptions. But for the most part, that's what it is. Now, why is that? Well, there's no large empire collecting taxes. So they don't build up a large military. They don't conquer other places. There's not a lot of emphasis put on intellectual accomplishments. The Catholic Church is by far the most powerful institution in Western Europe in period one still. And the Catholic Church of period one is very conservative. They don't want to change anything. They don't want to progress. They feel like they're doing it perfectly well. And as I mentioned yesterday or Monday, depending on which class you're in, the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages had banned any sort of study, research, reflection of Greek and Roman tradition. The Greeks and Romans were viewed to be bad. They were not Christian, the vast majority of them. So why should we study anything not Christian? And so we give up on a lot of that tradition, that history, that heritage, and we just abandon it. And so this is not the best time for a lot of reasons for these folks in Western Europe. I mentioned this yesterday, but I'll mention it again. We do have events called the Crusades. The Crusades are a series of religious wars where one of the popes tells the people of Western Europe, we need to go conquer the Holy Land where Jesus walked, where the disciples spread the faith. Now it's controlled by Muslims, and we don't like that. So we should go take it back. And there will be, depends on which scholar you ask, between 7 and 9 crusades over a 175-year period. And these continue into period 1. The Europeans win a few of them, but long run, the Muslim societies of the Middle East will win, and the Europeans will lose. But as I mentioned when we talk about Islam the other day, this leads to some cultural exchange between the Middle East, Western Europe, increased trade between those two societies. And so while the Europeans will lose these conflicts, and that's generally not a good thing, they will be enriched culturally. They will increase their trade with the Middle East, which also allows them to increase their trade with other societies like the east coast of Africa, with India, with China even. Because if you know anything about a map, Western Europe is far apart from a lot of these places, but when they start trading with the Middle East, they're starting to get those goods as well from Asia, from Africa, that they weren't getting otherwise. So in the long run, it's a good thing for many Western European societies to be exposed to the intellectual achievements, the culture, the military technology of the Middle East, and it will lead to an eventual improvement of those ideas in Western Europe. We'll talk about that in time period 2. Okay? A renaissance, if you will, but we'll get to that in the next time period. Now, let's talk about what is actually life like for these people. And this is in your study guide. These are 2 words, whoops. These are 2 words you may have learned in middle school, in 7th grade. We have feudalism and manorialism. I left out an I. These are the common systems that life is organized by in Western Europe during much of time period 1. All right? Technically, they're pretty close to each other. I don't care if you say the word feudalism and you're actually talking about manorialism. They're close enough. I'm not going to make a big deal of it. But here's the short version, then we'll talk about what they actually are. Feudalism is the political structure, is how most would define it. Manorialism is the economic structure and relationships. So feudalism, political, manorialism, economic. But if you use those terms interchangeably, I'm all right with it. If you look at your study guide for Europe in period 1, you will see it mentions both of those terms. Okay? You guys have probably studied feudalism before. You all should have read it last week. Can anybody tell me something about feudalism? What does that look like? How does it affect people's lives? What's good about it? What's bad about it? Anything.
It's kind of structured into a hierarchy.
Okay. What does that mean?
There's, it's like the caste system. There are people on the bottom and then like in the middle on the top, and like the serfs are in the bottom, and there's a lot of them. They do a lot of labor for the lords who are at the top.
Okay, good, Lauren, thank you. So it's almost like a staircase or a ladder. It's vertically structured. You have very few at the top. You have most people at the bottom. All right? She mentioned the word serf. You could also call them peasants. The reason we use the term serf is it implies that there's some part of this that is not their choice. They're stuck. Okay? They're very poor. But what does a serf do? What do they actually do most of the time?
Serfs can get employed by nobles to do labor work, and then later they can work on farms to like produce food to give to the nobles at a price or for free, and then they get to keep some.
Yes, okay, here, very good. So what it is you're a farmer for the most part. Some do basic maintenance, like you got to have some blacksmiths that shoe horses and whatnot, but the vast majority of people are farmers. This is what we call subsistence agriculture. I know in APHG, this is a term you use. What does it mean if your agricultural system operates under subsistence?
enough to like feed yourself and your family.
Yeah, there's no extra. There's not much extra going on. Okay, good. So if there's a famine, we die because we don't have a lot stored up for the future. Okay, so it's subsistence agriculture, manual labor from Español Los Manos, hand-based, okay, animal-based, so oxen, horses, that kind of thing. And they don't get a salary. They don't get a paycheck. As Mihir referenced, their pay is they get to keep some of the food they farmed, how nice, and then they get to live on the landlord's land. The landlord owns it, and your rent is you give me food. Since I don't get paid a salary, will these people ever be able to rise up the social ladder? Nope. Nope. This system just kind of evolves after the Roman Empire collapses. Kings give lords authority. Lords are in charge for the most part. Because yes, we may have a king, but the king may be hundreds of miles away. And it takes months to travel hundreds of miles. So the landlord is really running the show locally. And they can pretty much do whatever they want. Here is my favorite stat about period one. Feel free to write this down and then use it in an essay or a short answer that we're going to do in the future. In time period one in Western Europe, the average serf never went more than 10 miles from their home their entire life. Let me say that again. The average serf never went more than 10 miles from their home their entire life. Wow. Wow. Okay. My youngest brother and his wife and their kids live off Bardstown Road. Takes me probably 20 minutes to get there. So it's about 15, 16 miles. And I go over there all the time, play with my nieces. That's a 30-mile round trip easily. And I drive that all the time. Never more than 10 miles from your home your entire life. So generally, European society in the West was pretty simple. You had a small village, and there were farms surrounding it. You had the house of the big lord. If they were rich enough, it was a castle. Mostly it's just going to be a big house. And then every small village had a church. Because your non-work day, what did you do? You went to church. What if you didn't want to go? Wasn't a choice. You were expected to go. So the most important cultural value in Western Europe in time period one is the practices and beliefs of the Catholic Church. By far. There's not a singular empire. There's no Byzantines, there's no Mongols, but you have the Catholic Church, which in some ways acts like one of those things, but without the violence, usually, okay? So, and the conquest. So, feudalism is a system that works perfectly if you're rich, right? Why would they ever change this system? They wouldn't. There's no reason for the rich and powerful to get rid of the system. Well, we're not feudal today. Western Europe is not going to be feudal for 1,000 years. So it's going to take a massive, huge event to cause so much change that feudalism starts to fall apart. Now, this is not in your reading yet. It happens later on in this unit. But can anybody think or know or take a guess as what that massive change might be?
Was it the Black Plague?
It is the Black Plague, Luke. Very good. It's a huge pandemic. Sound familiar? Used to be I'd get some chuckles when I teach about the Black Plague. I doubt I'll get too many this year. But the Black Plague or the Black Death, which we'll talk about later on because it is a global illness, it's not just in Europe. We have better records in Europe, so we tend to look at it from a European perspective. But we know it comes from China. It travels through India. It goes to the Middle East before it ever reaches Europe. And then it eventually will go to places like Africa. It will go to everywhere as far as we know except for the Americas, because the Americas are isolated in time period one. They are not interacting with Afro-Eurasia at all. So the Black Plague, which is in the middle of the 1300s, so right smack dab in the middle of time period one. In China, 1331. Europe, 1347. East coast of Africa, 1409. Should I write down all those dates? No. I said them fast because you don't need to know them. But those dates happen across about a 75-year period in period one. Now, the difference between what we're dealing with now with COVID and with the Black Plague are a couple things. Number one, there was less international travel, so it took longer to spread. Obviously, it traveled much faster in the 21st century because we have international flights. I was in Brussels, Belgium in late January earlier this year. And we now know that COVID was already in Europe at that point. Because it was about 5 weeks later, we started the lockdown, stopped coming to school, et cetera, that kind of thing. So we already know that people had it already in Europe by middle January. So I never felt bad or anything, but I sometimes wonder if it was easily available. I'd like to get an antibody test and see if maybe I had it at some point. Because maybe I was asymptomatic and never knew it. I don't know. But anyway, the Black Plague is going to kill approximately a third to half of all Western Europeans. We don't know how many, and that's the other big difference between COVID and the Black Death. COVID is deadly. It kills people, but it tends to kill those with already weakened immune systems or those who are very old. There are exceptions, but you all know that. We've all seen the statistics. That doesn't mean it's not important and we shouldn't take, emphasis in it. We do. We also know you can have other health effects long-term besides just death. But the Black Death kills people and it kills them fast. Generally, from the time you started showing symptoms to when you got sick was about 24 to 48 hours. And oftentimes you were dead in 3 or 4 days. It's called the Black Death because, again, most people in Europe at this time are white. So it turns the lymph nodes of their body, which is where it attacks. As you may know from basic science, the lymph nodes, when they swell, that shows that your body is fighting an infection. If you go to the doctor, your doctor, to see if you're sick, your doctor will often feel around your neck because that's where your lymph nodes are, along with your armpits and your groin. Neck is the best option because when you're sick, your white blood cells start to fight that infection. And then the lymph nodes are basically the vacuum cleaners of the human immune system. And they start to swell because they get all this junk in there that they don't. In the Black Plague, those swelled and turned black and then popped like giant zits, oozing black pus. Also, the edges of your fingers and toes would turn black from tissue death, necrosis. So it gets kind of gross, okay? But the Black Plague will kill lots of people quickly. And what do these folks know about stopping this disease? What is their knowledge base?
God.
Zero. I see some zero. They don't know anything. They don't know anything about it. If I have a chance, I don't know if I'm going to get this time, but I have a picture I like to show you. Literally, it's a sketch of demons dropping like jars of disease on people. They had no idea what caused this. None. And what's the scariest thing about anything? The unknown. You know, if you pay money to go to a haunted house, they're going to try to scare you. You don't know when. And the scariest part is when you're not expecting it, right? I've heard people who are sick, who are trying to get a diagnosis. And of course, even if the diagnosis is bad, I've heard friends of mine who have had various illnesses say, like, it's at least comforting to know what it is, even if the answer is not good. It's the unknown is even more scary, because once it's known, you can start to fight it. So these people have no way to know how to fight this. Can you imagine everyone stayed calm when the Black Death starts to just go across Europe? What happened in America in the first few weeks of COVID when you went to the grocery store? What was gone? Specifically, one thing that you wouldn't think would be that important, but it was gone.
Toilet paper.
Toilet paper. Was there any rational explanation for why that happened? No. People were like, we're running out of toilet paper. It was 2 months where Louisville had a lot of toilet paper on shelves. Okay? So, when people get scared, they do things that don't make a whole lot of sense. They panic. They overreact. Sometimes that leads to bad events. So, across Europe, we're going to see riots. People angry, frustrated. But it's going to challenge the system. So let me put it in this way. The most basic economic principle is supply and demand. Why are precious metals like gold and silver so valuable?
There's not a lot of them.
There's not a lot of them. Fun fact, you're getting a lot of them today. All the gold ever mined on planet Earth would fill 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Let me say that again. All the gold ever mined on Earth would fill 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Now, if you've ever been down to U of L's natatorium, an Olympic-sized swimming pool is enormous. It's so deep that when the divers go off that really high board, they don't hit their head on the bottom. So it's a huge pool. But still, 2 of those is all the gold we've ever mined on this planet. Silver is valuable, but not as valuable as gold. Why? There's more of it. So when a supply is low, what often happens to people's desire to have it, also called demand?
It goes on.
Goes up. This is what we call, and I'm bringing some math in here, get ready. This is what we call an inverse relationship. When supply is low, demand is high. Okay? If you need bread, you're like, oh God, I got to go to the store today and get bread. That generally is not how people think. Because when you go to the store, there tends to be plenty of bread. Okay? When supply is high, demand tends to be low.
So would you say that it's like a pattern for like in times of pandemic, there people to like focus on government, especially considering like after the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter movement really took up a lot of speed?
Yeah, what I don't know, and this is something that I think will take years to study, is would it have had the same impact? Would it have had, because Black Lives Matter was already a concept. It was already a movement.
Mm-hmm.
Michael Brown, Ferguson, Missouri, that's 4 years ago. So did that make it more powerful and impactful to people because most of us were stuck at home, not going to work or school? Or would it have been George Floyd was enough, Breonna Taylor was enough anyway? And the answer is, I don't know. And I don't know if anyone's going to know that ever, but it certainly probably take a while. But yeah, that's a good question. I just don't know how to answer it. That's one of my favorite things about history is as many answers as you have, you also have more questions too. I don't know. So anyway, long story short, there is still a, let's look at the supply of workers, serfs. After the Black Death, many serfs are dead. So their supply has decreased. I don't know how you want to write this, but write this. Do you want to draw a chart or something? Feel free. Graph. So the supply of workers has decreased. Has the Black Plague diminished our amount of land to farm? No. And if land is not maintained, if animals are not fed that are domesticated, what's going to happen? Okay, the animals are going to die, the land's going to get overgrown, etc. So the demand for work is still high. But because the supply has gone down, the demand goes even higher. So here's my point. A serf had no rights. A serf was stuck on a farm. A serf couldn't switch to another farm. A serf couldn't leave their home. A serf couldn't demand to get paid. A serf couldn't demand to get land because there's so many serfs, you don't have any choices. There's no educational system for average people. So you have no education to give yourself any other opportunity. Your priests are generally going to be the children of rich families. Not always, but mostly. When Black Death happens, decrease in pop significantly. Now there's less workers, they can demand an opportunity. They can go to their landlord and say, I'll continue to farm this land, but I want you to give me 1 acre that is mine, that I own for myself. If you'd asked that before the plague, they'd have laughed at you. After the plague, you may not have a choice because what if all your serfs say, we're not working? Go find somebody else to work. There's nobody else to find. Or they could demand payment. I want you to give me money. I want you to give me money, which is something the average person didn't get access to. Or I'm leaving this farm. I'm moving to Paris. I'm moving to London. I have a cousin that lives there and I'm going to learn to be a blacksmith, or I'm going to learn to be a dressmaker, or I'm going to learn to do something. But I'm going to take a shot and move to another place. Could have never happened under feudalism, but we start to see, pardon the cliche, the beginning of the end of feudalism in Western Europe because of the Black Death. What are going to be the long-term impacts in our lives from COVID? Don't know. Nobody knows. They say they do, they're probably wrong. We'll get a vaccine eventually. 6 months, maybe. I don't know. You don't know either. They're working on it really fast. Like, I'm somebody who goes to a lot of concerts. I stand really close to people, often touching them that I don't know. Because I like concerts where you stand up in the general admission section more than I do sitting in a chair. I like that. I like being up close where you can like feel the music in your chest. Okay? Are people going to want to do that? How long is it going to take where we feel comfortable? I don't know. I don't know. I have been to the last U of L 2 home football games, but I sat with my family and we were 10, 15 feet apart from anybody else. So I like it. Is it the same as the previous experience? No. Some of you are involved in theater. Some of you are singers. Some of you are in the band. How soon till we can sing in a choir again? Don't know. I've heard some people say, like, I don't think we're ever going to shake hands with strangers again. I don't know if I believe that, but it's going to be a while. How long is a while? I don't know, and neither do you, and neither does anybody you know. So there are long-term, now, us not shaking hands is probably not as significant of an impact as the end of feudalism, but it's definitely, those things happen. So I want to be very clear on this, and then we're going to end this. Feudalism this is not Thanos, okay? This is not, we end feudalism right away. No. This is a gradual process that in some places takes decades, 30 years, 20 years. In some places, you still have feudalism till the 1700s. Every place is different. But I will tell you this, the Black Death, for whatever reason, impacts Western European populations more than it does Eastern. The death tolls are higher in Western than Eastern. So therefore, the impacts are greater in Western than Eastern. And so we don't see a lot of change in Eastern Europe in time period 2. Time period 2, Eastern Europe, pretty similar to time period 1. Western Europe, as you will discover, really different in time period 2 than time period 1. Why is that? One of the reasons I think so is the Black Death is worse in Western Europe, and therefore when you have that much death and suffering, it causes more change faster. Just think about it. It's the low end is 1/3 of all people died in Western Europe. The low end. Think about it in the next 5 years, maybe you don't want to. 1/3 of all people you knew and loved died. How's that going to affect your daily life? You're going to be happy? You're going to be like ready to go? And nope. But think also about what if 1/3 of the people you don't know die that do things every day that impact your life you don't even think of? I always say if we have a zombie apocalypse, I'm one of the first to go. There are no calluses on these hands. I don't know how to kill an animal. I mean, I guess I could get, but I've never done it. I go to Kroger and buy food. I go to restaurants and buy food. I don't make my own food. I've never grown a garden. I've never hunted. Unless you have a high emphasis on sarcasm, if the zombie apocalypse comes, I'm out of luck. What about the people that work at LG&E and keep the lights on? What happens when there's no more power? What happens when you can't charge your phone and Google stuff? I grew up in the south end of Louisville. My grandparents lived out here. My dad would not let me go visit them when I could start to drive unless I had to take a quiz, and I had to name every exit on the Watterson Expressway and the Gene Snyder in order. I'm sure none of you have done that because you got your GPS, you got your phone. Why would you? So I know all the exits on all the interstates in Louisville. I know I don't ever use a GPS in Louisville 99% because it's my city, and I grew up just kind of figuring it out. Most of you all use plug and chug and go. I'm not saying that's wrong, but what happens if all the people that keep our phones charged, that electricity is gone? So all I'm trying to get you to understand is the Black Death causes a major, major, major change in Western Europe. And most of that change we will discuss in period 2. Some of it good, most of it bad, but it will massively change that society in a way that would have never happened unless the plague had come. So, Mr. Rich, are you saying we're going to have massive changes in our society that, I don't know, probably by the time we notice, I'll be dead because I'm 41. So I'm talking like 100 years from now, 200 years from now, things that I won't even think about will probably be changed because of this global pandemic, sure. I mean, I've traveled abroad 25 times. When will I get to do that next? I don't know. I don't know. I visited 49 of 50 American states, just Alaska to go. When do I get to go to Alaska? I don't know. So these are all sorts of things. Now that's pretty low on the priority list, but those are things that are important. So Western Europe is dramatically changed because of this impact. Does anybody have any questions about feudalism, Black Plague, all that kind of stuff? Everybody understand that? Okay. Well, that took a little longer than I thought, which is why, we're just going through stuff. So we are not going to have time to get into our activity day. I posted some things on your stream that we will not use because we have 7 minutes and that activity will take probably 20 or 30. So there's no reason to even get into it. So we are ahead of schedule right now because technically we're supposed to be doing Islam today. So we're already a little ahead of schedule. So that's good news. And so I will fit those activities in later. So as I close, let me remind you of a couple